Today on the podcast, we're going to talk with expert coach Scott Johnston about aerobic development. Aerobic capacity is really the basis and the foundation of all endurance sports. If you want to be fast, if you want to be efficient, if you want to have endurance, you have to have a good aerobic system. And today we're going to talk about exactly what that means and how to develop it. Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Tracer Podcast. I want to tell you a quick story as I introduce my guest here today. I started running about 10 years ago. And when I first started, I really had no idea what I was doing. I just thought that the harder I ran, the more I suffered, the better I would get. And after about, I want to say 4 years of my running, I just was not seeing any improvement. And there was even some times when I was seeing regression. And I started to ask myself if this was really a sport that I was cut out to do. And it was at about this time that I came across this book. It was a new book, and it's called Training for the Uphill Athlete. And it taught me a completely new way to look at my training. And ever since I've understood what that book taught me, I've been getting faster. And that was, I guess, maybe 6-7 years ago. So today I'm honored to bring you one of the primary authors of that book, someone who has genuinely made a positive difference in my life through his teachings, and that is the legendary coach, Scott Johnston. So Scott, thanks so much for joining me for this podcast.
Well, that's very nice to hear you say, Joey, and thanks a lot for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, we have had quite a history, these past several years of exchanges by, both email and on the phone. And yes, I can remember some of those very early interchanges we had where it was pretty clear to me that you didn't know what you were doing. You were kind of flying blind, but I'm glad to see that it's working for you now, and you're finding out that, oh, actually I can run and I can enjoy this and I can get better at it. Yeah, without beating yourself to a pulp either.
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of life-changing for people who want to do the sport well and they want to see progress. Even people who are not looking to podium in big races or any race for that matter. Let's go back and talk a little bit about the book. So what led you and Steve House and Killian Jornet? For those of you who don't know, the other authors on the book are Steve House and Killian Jornet. And most of you who are in trail running, maybe even if you're not in trail running, you've maybe heard of Killian Jornet, the world's greatest trail runner, mountaineer runner, speed mountaineer. So what led you guys to write Training for the Uphill Athlete?
Well, I could sum it up and say hubris. And we keep it short. But so that what happened, the way Killian got involved is, so I coached Steve House through much of his professional climbing career. So Steve was at one time, 20 years ago or so, considered to be perhaps the greatest living alpinist. And I had coached him for 10 years or so until he had an extremely serious accident that almost killed him. And during the recovery from which, he wrote a book called Beyond the Mountain. And while he was on a book tour with that book, people began to ask him, well, how the heck did you train to be able to do all these things? And he sort of glibly remarked at one point in one of the lectures, well, I could tell you, but I would have to write a book, or it would take a whole book, something like that. And he approached me shortly thereafter and said, hey, I think we should write down what we did for my training. And I poo-pooed the idea, thinking nobody was really going to care about that. How many alpinists are training like we trained Steve? But eventually I succumbed. We thought we might, run off a few 100 copies at Kinko's and hand them out to our friends. Well, ended up that Patagonia published the book and we sold 100,000 copies. And one of the people who bought one of those copies was Killian Jornet. And Killian contacted us shortly after the book came out and said, "Hey, I love what you guys have done here, but I think you need to do something like this for, the non-climber mountain athlete, the skiers and the runners, because people are going to pick up this book and look at the cover, and there's a picture of Steve on some really crazy, scary, dangerous climb, and they're going to put it away because they don't do that kind of thing, and they won't realize." And this was Killian's virtually his exact words. They don't realize that the training that Steve did applies directly to these other mountain sports, the principles that are involved. And we can get into that kind of general theory later. But so Killian said, "I think you should write this book." And I said, "Okay, I will write the book if you'll help me." And unluckily for Killian, but luckily for me, he had a bad accident at the beginning of that ski season. That winter broke both his tibia and fibula in one of his, I can't remember which leg. So he was literally on the couch for a couple of months.
And that's the only way you can get him to help with the book, right?
That's exactly right. He's a pretty hard man to get to sit still. And so we had lots of time to collaborate and basically make the book, kind of appeal to and be more obvious how it would benefit the mountain runner and the skier, the backcountry skier, the ski mountaineering racer, that sort of thing. And the book became quite successful. It was published, I think we got that one published in around 2016 or 17, somewhere around there. The first book was published in 2013. But that's how Killian got involved in that process. And it was fun to work with him. He's a wonderful human being. I really enjoyed that time, our experience working together.
How much of his influence would you say made its way into the book? Like you had written, and the previous book, for those who are interested, is called Training for the New Alpinism. And then that's the one that Killian saw. And then you guys went and wrote Training for the Uphill Athlete, which, funny enough, Scott, I want to point out the cover of Training for the Uphill Athlete still has a guy running on a snowy ridge that looks like he's on the top of Mount Everest, by the way. So it's not exactly like Killian. The Western States 100 course or something like that. But
no, it's a pretty crazy photograph. That's actually Steve. Steve went and met up with Killian one time, and Killian was trying to set this record on this running loop, but basically not on a trail, was to run this ridge line near Zermatt, Switzerland. And so they went out and were kind of scoping out one segment of it one day. And Steve caught a picture on his phone. In fact, that photograph on the front cover was taken by Steve's cell phone. But it's of Killian running along this knife edge ridge. It's pretty dramatic. Right. And you're right. I mean, I certainly would never be running in a situation like that.
Exactly. Funny. So how much of Killian's influence made its way into that second book? Because, he saw the first one, you guys started talking, and I'm sure there was some back and forth, and maybe you would write pieces of it and he would review it and add maybe some thoughts. So how much back and forth was there, and how much of Killian's fingerprints are on this book?
Well, I'm sure I can, because I've spoken to Killian a great deal about this, but he and I are pretty much, as much as two people, coaches and athletes, can be, on exactly the same page in terms of the overarching philosophies of training for endurance. And so there was no need for, he wanted to have me say what I had said in the first book, but in the Uphill Athlete book, have it be more relatable to runners and skiers. So there was no issue with, the discussions on the physiology or some of the bigger methodological points. So that part we were completely aligned. Where Killian's fingerprints come in, and I think they're probably we felt like this would be the most influential, was some very specific takeaways. Here's how Killian does this. Here's how he thinks about that. Here's how he monitors his training load, those sorts of things. It was, so we tried to, and throughout that book, there are little, I don't know if you'd call them they're not sidebars, but they're like a sidebar. It'll basically
Yeah.
see, maybe after a section where we're talking about a particular more general concept, there would be a piece from Killian on, okay, this is how I apply that. This is how I do my intervals. This is how I do muscular endurance training, those sorts of things. And so that was really, it seemed like the best way to manage it. I'm not sure I could have honestly gotten Killian to sit down and write, 50,000 words on the physiology of endurance.
Right. It's just such an amazing book, and one of the parts that I really love about it is really the first section, and in that section, it talks about the physiology of endurance sports. It talks about metabolism, and it's not overly scientific. It's not like reading a research paper, but it's also detailed enough for somebody who genuinely wants to understand what their body's doing. They can actually get enough understanding from a chemical standpoint, from a metabolism standpoint, to, I think, make wise decisions as they move forward in their training. Can you summarize that first section a little bit for us here? And the reason I want to go into this is because there's a lot of hype around. I mean, it's not hype, it's legitimate. But there's all of this talk now about zone 2 training. And I've started calling it green zone, meaning it's aerobic training. And if you're in the green zone, it means you're not going into something over your aerobic ability. But I'll let you speak for yourself. What is it? What is zone 2 training to you? And what are some of the other things it's called, so that people listening, so that we can get calibrated on what we're actually talking about here?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to think of it, Joey. So I'm going to start by just with a little bit of history. So this is not something that I or any of the people who are speaking, writing, you're seeing on YouTube, podcast influencers, whatever. None of us invented any of this stuff. Although some of them, I think, like to pretend that they did, that this is something
Right.
new. I mean, this is 100 years old, honestly.
Awesome.
We may know a little more about the underlying science of what's going on metabolically now than that coaches did in the 1940s or something, or 50s. But those coaches that successfully coached endurance athletes in every sport, and I think this is something we should put right out now, Joey, is that when it comes to endurance training, a muscle is a muscle. And I don't care if you're training for rock climbing endurance or running endurance or ski mountaineering endurance or cycling, swimming, the muscle doesn't know any different. And the training methodologies that have evolved, and I'll say it's an evolutionary process, it's gotten us to where we are today in our understanding and the application of these methods, it's been basically a trial and error. And initially it was very much a trial and error because coaches didn't have access to the science. It was science until the internet came around. Most people you would have had to have gone to school to study the metabolism of endurance, and it just wasn't as readily available. But coaches 100 years ago understood that to train for endurance required a high volume of relatively low intensity training. Now, there have been swings in the intensity pendulum over these 100 years where for a certain coach or a certain cohort or maybe even a country would go towards, well, we need to have more high intensity. So, I mean, there's the famous and some of this has been misconstrued, and I think would be maybe a good time to talk a little bit about this history, in that when a certain athlete succeeded with a particular training methodology, and maybe it was, quote unquote, a bunch of high intensity training, then the pendulum would swing in that direction and people would think, oh, we need to have our training just include all this high intensity training. But then another coach would succeed. So for instance, the very famous Arthur Lydiard, who was one of the great running coaches of the 50s and 60s, produced a lot of Olympic champions. It was big on this long, slow, what they call long, slow distance, or long, relatively easy, low intensity training, which we now are thinking of in terms of this zone 2. But there have been other people around that same time. One of the more famous one is a Czechoslovakian guy named Emil Zatyopek. And Zatyopek did all of his training using intervals. Now, the thing is, that sounds like high intensity, but if you or I were given by our coach the prescription to go to the track and do 100 repetitions of 400 meters, yes, that's interval training, but it's not going to be very high intensity. I mean,
Ouch.
that's a heck of a high volume, and that's what Zatyopek did, and he did it almost every single day. And he changed, the some of the durations and some of the lengths a little bit. So this understanding of high intensity, low intensity, or interval versus long distance training, there's a lot of nuance here, which you and I don't really probably have time to go into the weeds on. But people need to understand that over this intervening 100 years, the pendulum between high intensity and lower intensity training has swung back and forth. But ultimately, the pendulum has kind of come to rest over on the low intensity side. By saying that, what I mean is that this lower intensity training it's the foundation for all endurance training. Now, that doesn't mean that it replaces high intensity training. High intensity training is still a critical component of endurance training, but it's not the basis of it. So now, to talk about what we mean by this low intensity training, we have two metabolic systems for producing the energy that we need to stay alive and especially to exercise. And one of those is a metabolic pathway that relies on oxygen. We call it the aerobic metabolic pathway. The other one is called the anaerobic metabolic pathway because it doesn't rely on oxygen. Both of these are capable of producing the energy we need. The pluses and minuses, they each have their kind of drawbacks and positive aspects. The aerobic metabolic pathway is somewhat limited in the rate at which it can produce energy. The anaerobic pathway is not rate limited very much. However, it has a negative feedback loop built into it that if you use the anaerobic metabolic pathway too heavily, this negative feedback loop will actually come in and slow down the anaerobic metabolism, so it can't produce the energy as fast. And this has to do with some underlying biochemistry, which we don't really need to worry about. So we have this one pathway that can produce a more moderate rate of energy, but can do it for a long period of time with really no negative effect. Then we have the other one, which is what we would think of as more the short-term, higher intensity, but we're quite limited in the duration that we can use that for. And so we can think of these two metabolic pathways that each require their own specific training methods. And if you train to develop what we will call anaerobic capacity, the capacity of the anaerobic system to produce energy, you are going to reduce the capacity of the aerobic metabolic pathway when you do that. Likewise, when you train to increase the aerobic metabolic capacity, you're going to decrease the anaerobic metabolic capacity. You can't increase both of them at the same time because they rely on different, they're completely different biochemical processes, really. And so it turns out that this aerobic pathway, the reason it's so important for endurance athletes, and this is where we get into the kind of lower intensity, slower training idea, is that any event that lasts more than 2 minutes is dominated, the energy production for that event is dominated by the aerobic metabolism. I mean, so at about 2 minutes, about 50% of the energy of a 2-minute event is going to come from the aerobic system, and about 50% is going to come from the anaerobic system.
Anybody running anything over 800 meters this conversation is going to be highly relevant to. If you're running 100 meters or maybe 400 meters, the anaerobic system is going to be key. And a lot of our discussion today probably won't be as relevant. But given our audience is trail runners and people who are out there for hours at a time, that's really what you're targeting here.
Absolutely right. But see, people are often shocked to hear that when we talk about endurance, we mean events that last longer than 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. And at 2 minutes, you're going to be using roughly half the energy production is going to be coming from the aerobic metabolism and the other half coming from the anaerobic metabolic pathway. But when you get out to 2 hours, it's already like 95% coming from the aerobic pathway. And when you get out beyond, 3 or 4 hours, then it's, almost 100% coming from the aerobic pathway. So that's one of the reasons so this aerobic metabolism is critical to endurance sports. And how do you train to improve what we call the aerobic capacity, the ability of the aerobic metabolism to crank out energy? And this is what, I think you can summarize that. So endurance is a metabolic effect. In other words, how quickly can our aerobic metabolism, which takes place in the cells, the muscle cells in our case, because we're talking about propelling our cells, all of our cells have mitochondria and have an aerobic metabolic component to them. That's how they stay alive. But for us, we'll just talk about muscle cells. And those muscle cells are producing a little chemical called adenosine triphosphate. And that's like the gasoline of the cell. It's what keeps it's the energy molecule for the cell. And surprisingly, what the metabolism does is it recycles the ATP. So as the ATP molecule is broken down, energy is released, and that energy that's being released is used for the contraction of the muscles that are propelling you. Well, then through metabolism, which takes the energy from your food, metabolism reassembles that ATP molecule that was broken down before so that it can then be broken down again. So it's just kind of a recycling plant that we've got going on. And we can either aerobically reassemble that ATP molecule using the energy from the food that we eat and oxygen, or we can anaerobically reassemble that ATP molecule once it's broken down. And as I said earlier, the anaerobic reassembly or the anaerobic recycling of that molecule comes with some pretty hefty negative, like the negative feedback and some drawbacks to it. But if we can increase the capacity of the recycling plant that turns over the ATP aerobically, that means we can run faster for longer. And so our focus as endurance athletes needs to be on developing aerobic capacity. So how do we do that? Well, it's not rocket science at all. The way it's done is through a high volume of aerobic training. Now, by aerobic, what I mean is training at an intensity that is where this recycling process that's taking place is predominantly being done by the aerobic metabolism. And how do you know where that occurs? At a certain intensity, as you move from low intensity to high intensity, the anaerobic system will begin to contribute more and more energy to the system overall, because as I said when we started this, the aerobic metabolism is somewhat limited in the rate at which it can recycle. So when it can't meet the energy demands, it calls in extra energy from the anaerobic system. But what we'd like to do as endurance athletes is decrease the reliance on the anaerobic system as we increase our aerobic capacity. And the way we do that is by training predominantly in this aerobic intensity realm. And there's a number of ways to determine this. You mentioned the MAF formula, the MAF formula, which was developed by Phil Maffetone in the 80s. And so I've known Phil for a long time, and actually had him on as a podcast on my podcast. So Phil came up with this idea many years ago. Actually, when I first met him in like 83 or 4, he was out stumping this whole idea where you want to train at low intensity to increase your aerobic capacity. Not many people were articulating it the way Phil was, but the way he did it, and frankly, it's a little oversimplistic, but it works pretty well, is he takes 180 and he subtracts your age from 180, and he says, okay, keep your heart rate below whatever that is. So let's say you're 30 years old, then you'd keep your heart rate below 150. Now, like many formulaic approaches to things, it's in general going to be true, but may not be very accurate for you personally as an individual. So there are other ways.
Quick, I've got a friend who his heart rate maxes out when he's racing hard at about 150. And when he's running easy, he's at like maybe 120. Compare that to me. When I'm running at 120, I'm in recovery zone. And when I'm at 150, I'm very conversational and I'm very aerobic at 150. And I really don't start going anaerobic until I'm in the 160s. So yeah, the one knock on using MAF is it's a starting point if you have no other data, but you may very quickly find out that you may need to adjust that up or down depending on what your body is. And the size of your heart from your genetics could play into that. The volume of your circulatory system could play into that. Genetics play into that quite a bit. So yeah, just little color note there. So keep going.
Yeah. So I usually only recommend people use that 180 minus their age formula if they've got nothing else to go on and they need a place to start. It generally will be very conservative. It generally will keep people from training too hard. So I think in a way that's good. The problems with it is, as you just said, it doesn't take into consideration your training history, your personal genetics. It also doesn't allow for changes. As I know from your history, Joey, the top end of your heart rate intensity zone for staying aerobic has increased dramatically, probably by 20 beats over the past few years. So what used to be, or you needed to stay in the below let's say 130 or so to be aerobic. Now you can be in this predominantly aerobic zone at 150. And one of the problems with those formulaic approaches is they can't really take into account this improvement. So, but that's probably one of the simplest way. Another very simple, low-tech way is, can you remain conversational at this? And if you can speak in, you're not going to recite the Gettysburg Address, but if you can speak in moderate length sentences without really having to gasp and lose your breath, you're probably in that aerobic zone. So if you can have a conversation with your running partner, then that's a good way to make sure that you're staying in this intensity zone that we would like to have you do in order to increase your aerobic capacity. There are a number of more high-tech ways to do it. You can go to a laboratory and spend a few $100s and be tested to determine this upper limit. They use what's called a gas exchange test that measures the oxygen intake and this carbon dioxide that you're blowing off when you exhale. And the ratio of those two can tell them when you are at the upper limit of this, the aerobic realm, that we'll call it. Another way is a fairly simple way is to choose we call the heart rate drift test, which is to choose a heart rate and begin to run at this heart rate. Now, it could either be done on a treadmill or outdoors on flat. It needs to be on pretty flat terrain, though. Because if you start introducing hills, and especially an out and back course, I don't recommend an out and back course because one leg will almost invariably be downhill and one will be uphill. But if you can do this on a running track or on a treadmill and you begin to run, let's say you just randomly chose 130 heart rate. I'm going to start running at 130 heart rate. I'm going to run for an hour at 130 heart rate, and I'm going to watch what happens to my running pace. Do I slow down during this? And if you slow down, then that would be the same effect as if you were to have said, okay, I'm going to run at a 8-minute mile pace. And my heart rate in that, let's say it started at 130, but at the end of the hour, I was still running at an 8-minute mile pace, but now my heart rate's 145, not 130 anymore. Your heart rate has drifted up. And the amount that it drifts up can be correlated to this, what we call the upper limit of that aerobic capacity. Often that's called the aerobic threshold. And so that this aerobic threshold that's what the math formula is trying to do. That's what conversational running is trying to do, is to determine what is your aerobic threshold. And
so, Scott, one question on this heart rate drift test that you're mentioning here. So just to summarize for our listeners, Scott's talking about the goal of this is to try to find out at what level can you run and maintain your aerobic, to not exceed your aerobic capacity, to not exceed your aerobic range, let's call it. And what Scott's pointing out is this heart rate drift test where you're going to run and then see how if your heart rate is drifting up, and if it's drifting up more than, what's your recommendation? 5%? Is that, after an hour? Is that's
what you typically use as the upper limit? We'd like to see it drift less than 5%, but a 5% upward drift would say you're right at the limit, that starting heart rate. So let's say it was 130, but then it drifts up to 143 by the end. That's about a 10%. That's a 10% increase. So let's say it drifted up half of that. So it would be 136 or 7, somewhere in that range at the end. Right. That would be a 5% upward drift. And we would say, okay, 130 is probably pretty close to the upper limit of your aerobic metabolism, where it starts to having to require more of the anaerobic system.
Now, one thing that leads to heart rate increases is dehydration. So what, like if you're in a really hot environment and you're sweating, a lot of people, myself included, will sweat 2 to 3 liters an hour in some cases if it's really hot. That will reduce your blood plasma and cause your heart rate to beat faster, just because you're trying to cool your body, as well as your hydration is down. So potentially your blood is thicker and your heart's needing to work a little harder just to deliver your heat limited, to cool your body and also to get that blood around. So what would you suggest somebody do to prevent complicating the test by those factors?
Well, if you're going to be training in the heat, then testing in the heat is not an unreasonable thing to do. But as you just pointed out, heat stress has a dramatic effect on especially your heart rate, because when your body's needing to get rid of excess heat because the core temperature has gone up too high, your capillaries in your skin dilate. And so more blood gets shunted to the skin to cool you. That leaves less blood available for the working muscles. And so the heart rate has to increase in order to keep pumping enough blood and oxygen to those working muscles. So it definitely complicates things. And during the course of a hot run, it is very likely that some of that upward drift is going to come not necessarily from what we would call an aerobic decoupling of heart rate to running pace, but more from this heat stress. And how you separate those is not clear, I think, to anyone. We don't know how those are related to one another.
So would you recommend, maybe just to simplify things, if you're going to do this test, you could potentially get on a treadmill in an air-conditioned environment, maybe put a fan on you, have a water bottle with some electrolytes in it, and sip those as you go? Would that be good advice?
That's a place, that's where we like to get people to start. Yes.
Okay.
Is let's do this in an ideal condition. And then, because once we determine that under an ideal condition, we know what this upper limit of your aerobic um, capacity, the heart rate at which you reach that aerobic threshold is, then we have an idea of where on an ideal day where you can train. But in the real world, you go out and you get hot, you're going to have to relative perceived exertion, what's often called RPE, will come into play on those hot days. You're going to have to realize, oh, I'm working a lot harder now than I was. And you're introducing a lot more stress on your body during those hot training sessions. And that can be a positive thing. There are definitely positive adaptations that come from training in the heat. One of them is an increase in blood volume. And so that's one of the adaptations that occurs that through heat acclimatization. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of a complicated subject, Joey, and I'm afraid I don't want to confuse people anymore. I want to stick to the ideals, the ideal
to the basics
world
here.
Yeah, because we can go down a lot of rabbit holes there. But one thing I think is worth mentioning is, like, why do we care about these zones? When people talk about training zones, and where do they come from? What is that all about? Now, there are a myriad number of zone systems out there, unfortunately, but I'm going to talk about where they started, because I was involved in this just not as a developer, but as an athlete myself. So the Finnish company Polar, which makes heart rate monitors, were the first people to make a wearable, real-time portable heart rate monitor in the early 80s. I was given one of those to use for training. I mean, they were big, they were clunky, like half the size of a pack of cigarettes on your wrist. And there were no, laptops and computers to download this, but they would keep track of your heart rate in real time, so you could look at it on your wrist. And then at the end, if you wanted to download the workout, you actually had to manually, take a piece of paper, and it would scroll through and it would give you your heart rate every 30 seconds in that workout. So you could write down, but it was very clunky to use. But when Polar did this, it revolutionized endurance training, because now you had a way to check your heart rate in real time for the first time ever. And so what Polar, because they're wanting to sell these things, they wanted to give people some guidance on how to use heart rate to gauge intensity. And they came up with essentially a 4-zone system. And the way it worked was, it was based on blood lactate. And for those people that don't know much about blood lactate, lactate is a byproduct of this anaerobic metabolism. Anytime you break down glucose or sugars for use as energy, this lactate is a product of that. And so the more sugar we break down, the more the anaerobic metabolic process is activated, the higher the lactate levels will be. Now, the aerobic system can also use sugar as well. But so anytime we need more energy, we're going to be using sugar rather than fat for fuel. And so we can use lactate as a proxy for intensity, turns out. Now, most people, especially back then, there were no portable lactate analyzers. It had to be done in a laboratory. It was quite a sophisticated process. But what Polar figured is, we're going to call zone 1 the point where the upper end of zone 1 will be where a person is making about 1 millimole per liter of lactate. Top of zone 2 will be where they're at approximately 2 millimoles. Top of zone 3, the top approximately 3 millimoles, and likewise the top of zone 4 millimoles. So it's a very simple system. By the time you get at the above into what now people call zone 5, above 4 millimoles, that's very intense training. That is training that hurts. When you're training under 2 millimoles, or in this case, in their zone system was 2 millimoles and below, was aerobic training. And that's most people consider that pretty low intensity training. So that's where the zone system came from. Now, since then, it's been added to and changed and modified a little bit, but I think most people will still predominantly use a 4-zone and sometimes even a 5-zone system. They might call that zone above 4 millimoles zone 5 or zone 4. It doesn't matter. I don't think that heart rate is a very good reflection at that intensity, because you're just basically going as hard as you can. And that will often be only sustainable for 20 to 40 seconds or so.
Yep.
But down in the low intensity end, zone 1 and 2 and even 3, then heart rate is a very good proxy for intensity, just like lactate is. But heart rate is, because of the modern wrist-worn heart rate monitors. Now, we should say that you still need a chest strap, because that's the only way to get accurate pulse data or heart rate data. But when you have real-time heart rate data, heart rate turns out to be a pretty decent proxy for intensity. It's a pretty good indication of what's going on metabolically in your muscle cells. Let me get a drink. Sorry. Sorry.
No problem.
So what we can do when we have this like we have like a tachometer on our wrist now, which tells us how our engine is doing when we look at the heart rate. And when we train at different intensities, we are training different metabolic systems in our body. And I've made it quite a crude thing and say, okay, we have at the high intensity, the predominant training stimuluses go to the anaerobic metabolism, and at the low intensities, zone 1 and 2, then the predominant training stimulus is to the aerobic metabolism. And the only way you can improve the aerobic capacity is by training with, as you said earlier, within the aerobic capacity, not above it. And this is a mistake that, for 20 years now, we've had this training fad in the fitness world that you could substitute intensity for duration. Mm-hmm. And that's just absolutely a fallacy. You do need intensity, but you do need duration. You need long duration in this, what we're going to call zone 2 and below. I'm finally coming around now to what you ask. You ask how we would define this intensity zone, and we call it zone 2 because that's how Polar defined it, 40, almost 50 years ago now.
Yeah. To summarize what you're saying, we need to train aerobically. We need to expose our bodies to a huge amount, as much as possible, really. If we want to do endurance sports well, our aerobic system has to get better. And the only way to do that is to expose our body to those conditions for long periods of time and accumulate a lot of volume over days and days and weeks and even years and years. You need to be able to do your training daily and get a lot of it in, and then come back the next day and do it again and do it again and do it every single day. And that's where you start seeing gains. And that's the magic of what Scott has taught me through his book. And you mentioned that this has been around for a long time, and that's true. But regardless of where you get this information, whether it's Scott's book or this podcast or somewhere else, easy, low intensity training is a staple and a fundamental to endurance training. And if you're new to the sport and you think that going out and doing no pain, no gain is going to get you anywhere, trust Joey Wilson here, who tried that for 4 years and got nowhere with it. One thing I want to throw in, Scott, and ask you about is that I've seen a lot of these YouTube videos or materials online talking about aerobic training, zone 2 training, and they kind of dismiss, I think, what it's really about. They say that it's for recovery, and they say that it's for not getting injured. That's what I see being thrown around quite a bit, right? Like, you got to do a lot of zone 2 because if you don't, you're going to get injured, or you got to recover from your hard workouts. It's the hard workouts that are really helping you. And this is just something you kind of throw in as like a filler to get you to your next hard workout. And I would challenge that. I'm curious if you agree with my challenge. My challenge would be no, it's the exposure time at the low intensity that is the valuable gold that you're mining during those low, like that an easy day is actually in itself, regardless of the other hard days that you're putting in your training schedule. The easy days are in their own value extremely important. How do you feel about that challenge that I would give to those people?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Joey. I think there is a lot of misconception about this. Yes, you do need to be able to run fast, but you want to run fast as aerobically as possible. And so let's talk a little more about this aerobic threshold concept, which would be the upper limit of your aerobic capacity, beyond the aerobic, what's often termed the aerobic threshold. Sometimes it's called the first ventilatory threshold. It's often sometimes called the lactate threshold. Exercise physiologists have not done the rest of us any kind of favors with their failure to standardize nomenclature. So there's a bunch of different terms that get thrown around for this. But once you exceed the aerobic capacity, or what I like to call the aerobic threshold, is sorry, I've got a little cold going on. Once you exceed that point, then more than about 50% of your energy is coming from the anaerobic system. So that's a fairly easy thing to define. Same thing or to delineate. And this is individual. Everyone is going to be somewhat different. Just like when you started, Joey, your aerobic capacity was quite low, and you needed to identify it in order to train below it. Because if you hadn't known that, I'm just picking some numbers here. If you hadn't known that your aerobic threshold was 130, you would have probably spent a lot of time training harder than that because it felt like training to you. Now, this is another mistake that people make with this low intensity training. It's often called long, slow distance. Well, it's only slow if you're not very fit. And I like to use the marathon is an event that is competed at one's aerobic capacity or just slightly above it. That means that Eliud Kipchoge's aerobic running pace is a 4.5 minute mile. Right. He can do 26 of those in a row. But it's the same. The 3 hour or the 4 hour marathoner, they're in the same metabolic state that Kipchoge is. Now, the only difference is that Kipchoge's aerobic capacity is so high, his aerobic recycling plant is so powerful that it can sustain a 4.5 minute mile pace. So as you pointed out earlier, he's not running harder than the 3 hour marathoner. He's just running a whole hell of a lot faster than the 3 hour marathoner. And that should be the goal of every endurance athlete, is to run as fast as possible, but as aerobically as possible.
And to kind of put some color on that, Scott, real quick, when you watch Kipchoge, who recently set a record, he ran a marathon in under 2 hours under some contrived conditions. That's true. But he ran a 1:59 something in this test that they did. And if you watch him finish that race, he comes in clapping his hands and jumping around, right? He crosses that finish line and doesn't collapse and go into a coma. He runs around giving everybody hugs and jumping around. Like, he's clearly not just suffering to the max limit. He's reached that level of economy where even as he finishes, and that's something I've felt in my own little world, when I have a great race and you come in and you're clapping and you're like, yes, versus when you've kind of overdone your capacity at the end of a race and you collapse.
Right. And so, but what the difference is from, let's say, the 2 hour marathoner to the 3 hour marathoner is he's producing a great deal more power than the 3 hour marathoner is. So from a neuromuscular standpoint, he's doing a lot more work, meaning that his muscles are taking quite a beating, even though metabolically he's in the same category, the same intensity zone as the 3 hour marathoner, who's not doing anywhere near as much, producing anywhere near as much power. And that's the reason that if you look at his training, and I don't have any privy to his training, but I have looked at other marathoners that are in that close to 2 hour range. 90% of their training is quite a bit slower than their marathon race pace. They don't run at that marathon race pace very often because it's so muscularly demanding. So they are training at a much slower pace most of the time. And that goes to your point of, if you want to, even for something as fast as the marathon, that, should be basically right at that aerobic limit for all of us, you still are going to be doing 90% of your training considerably slower than the marathon running pace. And that's to, as you pointed out, to improve your aerobic capacity. But I would, like you said, you asked earlier, how does that play into these people who say, well, a zone 2 is just for injury prevention? And well, if you just wanted to improve your injury prevention, you wouldn't run at all, because running is very prone to giving people injuries.
Right.
But I trained some of the fastest mountain runners in the world, and they do predominantly low intensity training. Now I can tell you that looking at podium finishers in some of the biggest racers in the world that I coach, their heart rate for most of the race is 130, 120. And these are people with aerobic thresholds of 150 to 160. Mm-hmm. So they're out there for a 10 to 20 hour race. Their heart rate's down in that low intensity, zone 1 even for them.
Right.
And they're relying on their aerobic capacity for those races. If they go above their aerobic threshold, and certainly if they go above the higher threshold, this threshold between zone 3 and zone 4, what we often is called the anaerobic threshold, or sometimes again called the lactate threshold, confusing array of names. I know, I'm sorry for that. Wish there was a simpler way. But if they go into those higher intensity zones, they're going to have a very bad race. I never see heart rates approaching that upper threshold, whether you want to call it anaerobic or lactate threshold or second ventilatory threshold. And so you're going to be racing in zone 1 and 2 with maybe a few forays up into zone 3 every now and then on some hills, but probably not even the upper end of zone 3, just the lower end of zone 3. So if that's the specific intensity that you need to be training at.
So as you're pointing out, and I know your book says this, that if you're aerobically deficient, if you're a new runner or just somebody who's never gone through an aerobic development block, let's say, or hasn't trained this way, at the beginning, you're going to be maxing out your aerobic system at a very low pace. And to go any faster, you're going to be moving into anaerobic, where your the correct system is not going to be stimulated. And as you get faster, that intensity starts to go up, where now if I'm running at the top of my zone 2, which is probably around 160 to 165 for me, there are times when I feel like I'm really moving. And as you point out, it becomes more of a muscular challenge once you start to get rid of that aerobic deficiency. How do we throw in the intensity, and should we throw in any intensity, in your opinion, during our aerobic building? So let's say we're coming at this from a deficient state, and we just need to build up that aerobic capacity. Is it advantageous to throw in maybe one day a week where we go out there and maybe run in a closer to anaerobic state, maybe something in zone 3, or at a typical threshold run or a tempo run to most of us during that period? Or would you advise somebody who's struggling with their aerobic base to just drop all expectations of intensity and just hunker down for as long as you can in the aerobic zone?
That's a great question, Joey, because as you have said, one of the biggest problems of getting people to buy in and adhere to this is that they're probably used to running harder or faster than their aerobic system can truly support. And so when you ask them to slow down, it doesn't make intuitive sense that, hey, if I slow down, how is that going to help me run faster? So like taking 2 steps backwards in order to go forward again. Mm-hmm. And this is the biggest issue I have faced for 20 some years now with this, is getting people to understand. It's like, no, you need to go to the remedial reading class for a while before you start trying to read Shakespeare. And if you do that and you get your aerobic system, your aerobic house in order, let's say, then we can really move into training. And I like to tell this little story because it's pretty poignant, and I think so there was a Hungarian coach in the 50s who produced a number of world champion runners, world record holders. And luckily for him, he just happened to be out of the country at a race in 1957 when the Soviets invaded Hungary. And so he decided never to go back. And he ended up in Santa Monica, and he started the Santa Monica Track Club, which produced among quite a few champions, one of them being Carl Lewis, but also a gold medalist in the 5,000 meters. So in the 60s, this guy ran this incredibly successful program out of Santa Monica, and his name was Mihaly Igloy. And Igloy was another one of those people who has been misunderstood because people say, oh, he just did all this high intensity training, lots of interval training. Well, I happen to have a good friend who was a speed skater, and actually quite a good speed skater, 2-time Olympian, former world record holder, who lived in Los Angeles. And he was, at that time, trying to find good coaching advice was pretty tough. So my friend Dick went to Igloy and he said, hey, I'd like to have you help me. I'd like to have you, I've seen that you've been very successful with all these runners. I'd like to have you coach me. And Igloy's response was, and this is so poignant, so telling, he said, I will, but you go away and you come back to me when you can run 10 miles every day for 30 days in a row. And when you think about that, okay, that means he didn't even want to start training Dick until he knew that Dick had the aerobic capacity to run 10 miles every single day for 30 days in a row. And so here's a guy who's famous for his interval training methodologies, mm-hmm. who also understood the importance of this aerobic base that we're talking about. So mm-hmm. back to your question now, with that little bit of background, this struggle is to get people to understand, no, I mean, obviously, if you're going to run 10 miles a day for 30 days in a row, you're not going to be running particularly fast. No one could do that. So it's definitely going to be slow aerobic, or well, maybe not too slow, but going to be low intensity aerobic training. And to get people to buy into this, what I've had to do, I worked with a number of folks, some of them who have been very high level, believe it or not, who were aerobically deficient. Sorry. I've had one guy who said to me, well, I have to put a paper bag over my head because I'm so embarrassed that I'm running this slowly when I go outside. But a few months later, just like you saw, a few months later of this kind of training, and now it's not slow anymore. And once you get this base in place, then it's necessary to start adding intensity. Until that base is in place, doing long duration, high intensity training all it will do is slow the adaptation and the development process of this aerobic system. So even doing 1 day a week of tempo running or going to the track and doing 400-meter repeats seems kind of harmless, but it's actually going to slow down the development of the aerobic system. That, again, this does not mean that tempo running or 400-meter repeats on the track are not valuable. It's just that for this person that's aerobically deficient, they're going to slow the process. So what I do with folks who are aerobically deficient is we do fast running, but we do it for very short durations so that it's not not taxing their aerobic system with this. What we're doing is it's more like muscular training for them. So we use strides in there. So they might go out for an hour run, and during that hour run, they will do 6 times 15-second strides. We also do what we call hill sprints to develop leg power. So those are pretty useful tools for keeping the muscles tuned up for higher intensity work when you've got just to do this aerobic base work.
Yeah, and it's right in line with Sandy Nypaver. She was on a previous episode of the podcast, and I asked her a similar question. Like what is something people need to do just to go out and enjoy the mountains? And she said, you can start with just a lot of easy running plus some strides, right? And it's a very similar answer to what you're saying. That is the foundation, so that you're not totally neglecting your economy. You're not totally neglecting that kind of spring in your step that you're trying to develop. But the focus is not to get your body to turn over sugar stores as fast as possible, like a tempo run trains your body to do. It's to develop that aerobic. You call it that. Get your aerobic house in order. That's a Scott Johnston phrase that I've heard many times. So kind of in conclusion here, and there's so much that we could talk about, but I think this will be a good place to kind of start wrapping this up. Would you say that more aerobic is always better? Or does there come a point where it's like you're doing too much aerobic and now it's time you gotta graduate from that? There's these different phases of your training, and if somebody's coming in without any aerobic development and they haven't built that, they haven't gotten their aerobic house in order, they have not laid that concrete foundation of aerobic base, then of course probably the more the better, as long as you're not, like to your point of the 10 miles for 30 days straight and be able to handle that fine. But at that point, let's say you've got your aerobic house in order. Does there come a point where you're wasting your time just doing more of it?
Well, I guess there's a number of things I could say about this, but I'm going to start with that there is no such thing as too much aerobic capacity. And I mean for every single athlete, even for the 400-meter runner, increasing aerobic capacity will always benefit an athlete, even a power lifter. Now, there is a trade-off that will come with, especially in these shorter events like powerlifting, and I mean, power lifter doesn't need to be putting in 100-mile weeks of running. That would be a mistake. But right. improving the power lifter or the 400-meter runner's aerobic capacity is going to enable them to handle more hard, high-intensity work because they'll recover faster. So more aerobic capacity is always a good thing. Now, how you get it, that doesn't mean that more aerobic volume is always going to be a good thing, because these aerobic adaptations will plateau. You're going to reach an age-imposed, genetics-imposed, training history-imposed limitation. So sort of, we'll have this limit that no matter. And it seems like when you get beyond 100 miles per week, there have been many studies done on marathon trainers, that the returns become quite diminishing. Going to 120-mile weeks really going to be much better than running 80 or 90-mile weeks? And they find that no, it actually doesn't change the aerobic capacity very much, because people who are training at that volume, they've been at this for years and years, and so they probably are reaching their genetic and age-related limits. And so they do need to, those folks have to have faster, higher intensity training built into their program. Now, we could say the same thing for people who, even if they're aerobically deficient, let's say and perhaps you even went through this, and I kind of remember you and me having some conversations like this years ago, where you're going, wait a minute, I got Speed Goat coming up. If all I do is go out and run around at 13-minute miles, what's going to happen in that race? Well, you're probably not going to have a very good race. I mean, you can't go at some point, even if you're aerobically deficient, at usually no less than about 6 or 8 weeks before your race, you better start including some what we would call zone 3 or tempo level efforts into your training to have a successful race. So what I often tell folks is, okay, you're aerobically deficient, but whatever your aerobic capacity is right now, that's what you're going to have for this race. We got to start adding intensity into your training. But now somebody who's very well aerobically adapted, somebody who's been at this for a long time, a high level runner, they're going to include that high intensity training pretty much year round into their program, because that's where they're going to start to see they've maxed out the aerobic capacity. And so they need to start, like as you were saying, they need to develop the ability to turn over sugar faster. Mm-hmm. So, and there's only one way you can to train that. And I'm a big fan of tempo running for ultra runners. Even for some of the folks that I coach who are quite fast, we never do any training in zone 4.
For long ultra marathons, like 100 miles.
For ultra marathons, yeah. We do a lot of training in zone 3 or tempo efforts, and we for those folks we usually use blood lactate measurements to make sure they're in that right intensity zone. So that hope that answered that question about adding intensity. It is vital.
Yeah, and it's funny because we'll get customers at Tracer who sign up and they'll get on the Max King marathon program, or they'll get on the Higher Running 50K program or something, and it'll generate the first 2 weeks of training for them. And often there's a ton of easy running, especially in the first 2 weeks leading into a program, right? And we'll get people who say like, hey, this is like way too easy. And I'll go look at what has been generated, and I'll say, no, that's like you're getting a pro for a reason here, and that's because you don't know what you're doing, right? And it's just I think for people who are listening, the point here is that this low intensity running is the staple, it is the basis, it is the foundation of everything that you do. It should not be discredited. If you want to get nowhere, like I was for the first 4 years of if I would have learned this right out of the gate, I would be faster than I am now. And I've made a lot of gains. And I just look at those 4 years and I say to myself, man, what a waste. I could have been accumulating so much speed and efficiency and strength during those years that I didn't, because I didn't know what I was doing. So I think the main takeaway here, talking to Scott, has been, an easy volume is critical. If you haven't been doing that, you are likely aerobically deficient, and you should spend your time learning this and investing in yourself, and maybe take racing off the table for a year. That's what I did. Just take the races out of you'll be okay for one summer not doing any races, and maybe just go enjoy some really easy training and a lot of it, and go out and see the mountains and go to the peaks that you want to go to, or go to the trails that you want to go to, or run the roads that you want, whatever you want to do, and invest in yourself and get that under your feet. And then you can come back next year and really decide how are you going to tune it up, and you bring in some of that more intense training and really dial the specifics to the events that you want to do. And then the second takeaway is like, you have to know your zones here. In order to do this well, you have to know your zones. Scott's mentioned a heart rate drift test, which his website has documented in many different places. I'm pretty sure you can go to Evoke Endurance. Is it Evoke Endurance? Did I get that right? Yep. EvokeEndurance.com. They sell coaching services there. They have a bunch of articles you can go read about how to do the heart rate drift test. So go learn how to do that so that or use another method if you have to. It doesn't matter, but figure out where you're aerobic and go read online how to do that. Follow Scott's advice here, and then spend a bunch of time below that threshold in that zone. Of course, bringing in the higher intensity stuff when the time is right. You're going to need that. I personally, when I went through this process, saw a huge amount of gains just from the aerobic development, But then I kind of did plateau for a while. And only after I started doing some of those faster sessions, then I came out of the plateau. But it had to be in that order. It had to be get your aerobic house in order, then add the once you've plateaued that and seen the gains from that, then you can start to think about, some more exotic workouts like the higher intensity that will get you that. The third takeaway is throw in those strides. If you want to maintain that kind of spring in your step, throw in those hill sprints, throw in those strides, and that will stimulate those muscles to be bouncy, to be efficient in the faster running without telling your metabolism that it needs to be anaerobically efficient, but rather you want it to be aerobically efficient. So many great things that we could talk about today, Scott. There's only so many hours in the day for you and I to powwow about this stuff. I had a whole list of questions that we didn't get to, so maybe we'll have to do this another time in the future. But yeah, you can check him out. Scott, where should people find you if they want to get a hold of you? And where can they get your book too?
Yeah, Evoke Endurance is the website for my business, and we really focus on education. So there's no paywall; everything is free. We're just trying to disseminate good, solid training information there. Yeah, we do offer coaching and sell training plans like anyone to keep the doors open, but our real mission is to educate people on proper training because there's so much terrible information out there. The books are available, and probably the simplest thing, if your local bookstore doesn't have them, they're available on Amazon. Training for the New Alpinism and Training for the Uphill Athlete. And Joey, you said a couple of things there at the closing that I think I'd like to reinforce, and I'm sure you saw this, but I've done this now for decades, and with literally thousands of people. And it is not at all uncommon when I get an aerobically deficient athlete that one of our coaches begins to work with, who, depressingly for them, their aerobic threshold running pace might be, 12, 13-minute miles. It's not at all uncommon. Frequently, almost without fail, within 6 months of this type of training we're talking about, just staying in this aerobic zones that we're speaking of, we'll see 2 to 3 minutes per mile come off of that. So we'll take somebody who's a 12-minute mile aerobic pace to a 9-minute mile aerobic pace with no intensity training whatsoever. And that's in just a few months. And those same people, that development will continue, 2 years later, they'll be running at a 7.5-minute mile aerobic threshold pace. And again, with no high intensity training. We see this all the time. Now, again, I'm not trying to say, I want to make this very clear because people have sometimes accused me of kind of poo-pooing high intensity training. I know very well the importance of it. What I'm trying to point out by these statements and these examples, which are literally hundreds of them, is that just focusing on this aerobic development can make massive gains. It would be impossible for somebody to move, let's say, their anaerobic threshold running pace by 3 minutes per mile. That's going to never happen. But we can improve the aerobic threshold running pace easily by 3 minutes per mile. Even for somebody, I've had people who've come to me with, in one particular case I can think of, 8.5 mile aerobic threshold pace in 5 months dropped to 6 minutes and 15 seconds per mile running pace at the same intensity. So there, don't think that this is always going to be slow. That's I think my final takeaway here, or final point I want to make, is that it may be slow when you start, but the only reason it's slow is that your aerobic recycling plant is not working properly at this point.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. If you want to get fast, or you want to just get efficient and enjoy a very quick movement, let's say, even if you're not racing, you got to do it this way. It really is tried and true. I've seen huge gains. My running is so much better. I would have quit the sport, 5-10 years ago if I did not learn the things that I did from you. Thanks so much for this discussion, Scott. Congratulations on all of your coaching achievements, the athletes that are out there doing amazing things. Thanks so much for all of the free material you've put online. I know it's huge and vast, and for your awesome book. And thanks for doing this today.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, Joey. It's been fun to reconnect.
Thanks, Scott. Talk to you soon.